Well, hello everybody and welcome to a new video. I've been awfully quiet, I know, and that is because, well, life happened mostly. And also, Flurfia has turned kind of boring. You know, Flat Earth was kind of like this car crash for a while that you just couldn't look away from, but now it's just this dirty, nasty piece of road left after that crash, with car parts and blood and puke stains still left there, and everybody just kind of avoids it. So anyway, I turned back to my hobby, and the small gains of which you can see right now on the screen. And while I was stacking my photos of the moon, I found something, well, a little different on YouTube. Let's put it that way. This is Gary Fong, a YouTuber who claims to have been sponsored by Hasselblad and is a professional in every which way. And he recently posted a video claiming that one aspect of the Apollo 11 moon landings is highly improbable, if not even impossible in his expert opinion. What is he talking about? Well, he claims that the images taken outside of the lunar lander could not have been taken with the gear that NASA said they took it with. Well, Hasselblad themselves are contradicting him here, so this should be pretty interesting. Also, if other photo enthusiasts like me are watching this video, maybe the name Gary Fong rings a bell with you as well. Because about 15 years ago-ish, this Gary Fong was the hot tamales, the bee's knees, the buzz in the photography industry. He was a wedding photographer, and he posted quite successfully video tutorials on photography and camera gear. Later on, he also had his own product line of flashlight diffusers, and of course he also published a book, because why not? Anyway, it's fine for me that this guy is a millionaire. I'm all for it. Let the guy live off of his merits. But what he's going on about in this video about the moon landing is just wrong.
Questions from a technical perspective, from a professional. How could these photographs actually exist from the moon? Now, I'm saying that as an expert because I was a professional photographer for 20 years, and I shot most of my career with Hasselblad cameras. So I know these cameras inside and out. I know how to load the film in the dark. I know how to operate it, and I even know the sound that the camera makes if there's a problem with the leaf shutter. And I'm not alone. There's a lot of photographers who photograph millions of exposures with Hasselblad cameras. And for those of you very valued professionals, seasoned professionals who are experts in Hasselblads, you'll probably appreciate this a tiny bit more, because I'm going to go into a little bit of technical detail explaining why these photographs from the moon probably didn't come from the moon. Now, not only was I a professional photographer who used Hasselblad cameras, I was also sponsored by Hasselblad as a visiting lecturer for Hasselblad University. And I also was the operator of Pictage Incorporated, the largest pro digital film lab in the United States at the time. And so I know a lot about handling the film, how it's processed. I know a lot about film characteristics, and I know a lot about the Ektachrome 160 film that they shot on the moon, and therefore I can talk meaningfully about why the camera probably didn't 100% impossible with the camera that actually held the decommissioned moon camera.
Wow, that was quite a mouthful. You will notice that this guy talks a lot and he's all over the place, but let's try to sort this out. What I found interesting was that he was using the past tense quite a lot. He was a wedding photographer and he was affiliated with Hasselblad in some way or another. Quite interesting. Also, I found that he indeed lectured at the University of British Columbia at the Okanagan campus about, well, not photography per se, but more about creativity, meditation, and a certain type of special rock called shungite that apparently heals everything, even 5G. And well, what a coincidence. He also sells this special rock on his channel right now. Also interesting. Hasselblad is a camera manufacturer that kind of specialized in the medium format business. So they do not run, or did not run, the normal 35mm film that everybody used back in the day, but larger types of film. So these were also large cameras. And also Hasselblad was one of the first to fit their cameras with electric motors back in the 60s to advance the film automatically. So larger film basically means more detail in the photos. So those two factors, the motor and the big level of detail, made Hasselblad or Hasselblad cameras interesting for NASA and for space photography. And one of those cameras you can see right here on the screen. But there were in fact other types of cameras used before the Hasselblad, even in space. As you can see right here, for example, this is astronaut Ed White wielding a little Contax camera that you can see right here, the black thing. And it took perfectly nice pictures out there in space. If you're interested in Hasselblad cameras in space and space photography in general, I highly recommend this video by an actual Hasselblad-Expert. It's about 1 hour long, but it's an hour very well spent in my opinion. So again, highly recommend it. I will link it in the description.
And therefore I can talk meaningfully about why the camera probably didn't 100% impossible with the camera that actually held the decommissioned moon camera.
So there you heard it again from the goat's mouth. He is saying that the photos from outside the capsule were impossible to make and therefore didn't happen. Of course, this is a bullshit argument to make in and of itself, simply because there's not just those photos from the Apollo 11 mission, but as you have seen, from previous missions and also from later missions. Not only with Hasselblads, but with all different camera types and brands. So, Gary, I really hope you thought this through, because you're making some big ass claims here. Let's go through all of his claims one by one.
How come this isn't weather sealed? How come there's all these like holes and crevices, like right here in the dark slide, microdust can get inside there, go between the film plectrum and the lens, dust up the lens, and really...
Well, the first point is, Gary's right. Dust is a big problem. And as you can see, all those problems were in fact documented. This is a PDF, of course, also linked in the description, where they noted all the issues that they had due to dust. And there are a few points where actually the cameras were compromised, or at least partly didn't work due to the dust problem. So this was a thing. Everybody knows about it. This is no secret. By the way, this is still a big thing, and in the coming Artemis program that hopefully will launch in November this year, that's the reason why for this Artemis program the new spacesuits that they are developing take a shit ton of time and a shit ton of money to develop, because dust on the moon is an actual big hazard. It's basically millions of tiny sharp shards of broken rock because there's no erosion on the moon. And that's also why in the past, starting with Apollo 11 or maybe even earlier, that is why the astronauts were told to be careful with bringing dust into the Eagle module and onto the cameras. And they even had cleaning kits to clean out the cameras in the module. And you can find on the photographs that are published scratches on the negatives, which probably came from dust on camera parts scratching the film. Also, this is not what happens to things in space. Stuff doesn't freeze or anything like that in the vacuum of space. So you don't actually have to seal things for vacuum like this expert thinks it does.
Yeah, there's a number of things that absolutely do not make sense if you are a knowledgeable professional photographer who has shot with Hasselblads. So, number one is this. Okay, so caution, do not touch the glass surface. That glass surface that they're talking about is called a reso plate. And that reso plate gave the little squares that they used later, that they said they used later for positioning, distances between things, although you could overlay the squares on top of the actual photograph and do the same thing. But the other thing that was really kind of interesting is what I saw here was the remove dark slide. Now the remove dark slide warning here, it says remove dark slide before installing the magazine. Now if you are in fact a Hasselblad photographer, you'll know that the dark slide has to be in when you take off or remove the film magazine from the camera. And the reason that's the case is because the dark slide protects the film from being exposed as you're taking the film magazine on and off. Doesn't that make sense?
He is right with the reso plate that he mentioned. Let's start there. A reso plate is a glass plate that is positioned between the camera lens and the actual film, and it makes for these funny X marks that you can see right here. And those X marks were actually used for measurements, because if you know the focal length of the lens and, for example, the size of a reference object in the frame, you can deduce the size and distances from other objects in that frame, say rocks or craters, for example. So that's quite interesting. The other part, or the other point that he's trying to make, is the one with the dark slide. What is a dark slide, you ask? Here is another website that actually shows how a dark slide in a regular medium format film magazine works. And here's the Apollo magazine. And this website explains quite logically why the dark slide was used the way it was during the Apollo missions. So it is in fact true that the astronauts pulled out the dark slide before they connected the magazine to the camera. And it is true that this exposes the film. The reason why they did this is to not damage the aforementioned reso plate in any way by pulling out the dark slide. The reason why this is not a problem is that this magazine is not your standard film magazine, as he mentioned himself, the so-called expert in analog film photography. He himself mentioned that this special magazine holds 200 exposures, and that is correct. Kodak developed a special film just for the Apollo missions, which was extremely thin to hold that high number of exposures. So, what did the astronauts do when they pulled out the dark slide? They connected the magazine to the camera, they loaded the film, and then they advanced the film for 2 or 3 exposures to make sure that they have an unexposed film ready. Because when you pull out the dark slide, just the film right in front of the dark slide gets exposed. The rest of the film that is still rolled up on the spool does not get exposed. And since they have 200 exposures, it's not a big deal. And again, this is even talked about on a NASA website and explained thoroughly and logically. So if Gary, you had done a little bit of research, you would have noticed this.
NASA screwed, you can see a screw right here. They literally screwed on these levers so that the astronauts can turn the shutter speed dial. They're locked together, so the shutter speed and the aperture dial were locked together so that they would go in unison.
This is his second point, and I'm going to interrupt him right there because he's going to blather on about other things. It is true that NASA fitted the lens with a special lever. This makes sense because the astronauts had big gloves on. Now, just to explain, on these types of cameras, you set the exposure time and the f-stop and the focus all on the lens. So you have basically 3 dials that you have to turn to control these 3 settings. But one thing he says doesn't really make sense, which is that the f-stop and the exposure were screwed together and therefore locked together. That doesn't make any sense. And again, if he had done a minimum amount of research, he would have noticed that in fact the shutter speed, so the amount of time the shutter stays open, was fixed to 1/250th or 1/4 of a second. And the lever that he's going on about controlled the f-stop. The astronauts had to manually control the f-stop, and they even had a little diagram on the back of the camera, as you can see in this image right here, which told them which f-stop to use. What they also had to do was to work the focuser. This one also had a lever screwed onto it. The dial for the focuser had a lever screwed onto it. The dial for the focuser was also preset to 3 positions, near, medium and far, that they could set with their big gloves on. So again, Gary got it all backwards because he didn't do any fucking research.
Lock the 2, but then make them movable. Man, that's a disaster, because look what happened to this poor shot right here. 1/4 of a second at f16. Now, that's blurry, but ridiculously overexposed. What they should have been was 2/50th of a second at f16. Okay, so that's completely wrong. But this puppy is screwed in and dialed in. That didn't make sense to me. And again, I'm talking about if you were a race car driver and you...
Okay, so now he's talking and blathering on with his race car analogy. Anyway, again, the point is those two, the exposure time and the f-stop, were not locked together. The astronauts just dialed in the f-stop. The exposure was fixed to 1/250th of a second. Also, it's quite possible to shoot at 1/250th of a or 1/4 of a second. It's not impossible. It becomes even more possible when you are working at 1/6 of Earth's gravity. And it becomes even more possible to take steady shots at 1/4 of a second when you have the camera fixed to your spacesuit. And when you have a shit ton of training taking photographs.
Sense. And I'm going to ask you this, just common sense here. If NASA publishes that in direct sunlight, the temperature on the surface of the moon reaches a boiling 250 degrees Fahrenheit, while nighttime temperatures, in other words, when they're on the dark side of the moon, go down to minus 208 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. 250 degrees will boil water. You've got slide film. I don't know if you've ever left film. So many of you have never even experienced film, but if you've left film in a glove compartment on a hot day, you'll expose the film. Okay, so not only will you expose the film, but the film can decrystallize and melt.
Okay, so this next issue that he has obviously nothing to do with camera tech, which, just a reminder, is his expertise. The next issue has to do with physics of space. And he does quote this NASA paragraph here, but let's note one important issue here, that NASA talks about surface temperatures. Surface temperatures. Gary, of course, misses this completely, but it will become important shortly. Now, I will not play the part where he ridicules other commenters. Firstly, because the commenters also got it wrong, at least the one he quotes. And secondly, because this is just a dick move. Gary positions himself as the one that has to defend himself against backlash and nasty YouTube commentators, where in fact he is the one that made the claim that space photography is fake. So, Gary, you made a positive statement. Your statement was that space photography is fake. So, you should have been prepared for answering such questions.
Really? That's kind of weird. I have a degree in pharmacology from the University of California.
So, Gary, as a trained pharmacologist, you surely have boiled a thing or two, haven't you? Have you used water or fire for that? Well, Gary, on the moon, what is there between the surface of the moon and the camera? Right, nothing. Vacuum. No boiling water. Nothing. So, the camera was not exposed to the surface temperature that you quoted from NASA, because that's the surface temperature. Okay? Agreed? Great. So now we can just ignore the 100 degrees C, can't we? And what he does correctly explain in his video are the 3 types of thermal conduction. He obviously looked that up on Wikipedia. Or his studies of pharmacology did in fact pay off there. Good for him. So, the only thing that does have an effect on the camera is the radiation coming from the sun. And this is why the camera was colored the way it was. The camera for the outside expeditions on the moon was in this aluminum color to reflect as much sunlight as possible. The other cameras that they had with them that stayed in the Eagle and the Columbia module, they were black to minimize reflections off of the windows. So the metallic casing reflects most of the radiation from the sun. Not all of it, yeah, but as a trained pharmacologist and physics and science expert who has boiled a thing or two things during his training, one should know that boiling or heating in general does not happen instantaneously. It takes time. And besides, even if the outer casing of the camera was hot after the 30-minute spacewalk, the inside of the camera, in which there's also vacuum, this will also take a while. So, Gary is conflating so much here that he's clearly out of his depth. What's even funnier is that he keeps reiterating that he's an expert in cameras and film, where yet he fails to comprehend even the basics in physics. The film was never exposed to 120 degrees C, as if it were dropped into boiling water.
You've got it in. I want you to do me a favor. I want those of you who are really skeptics, I want you to take a battery, a NiCad battery, maybe lithium ion, they're better for heat, but put it in boiling water and you tell me if it explodes. Let me know how that goes.
So same basic misunderstanding, different camera part, the battery. But seriously, Gary, you're encouraging your gullible audience that buys magic rocks from you to throw batteries into boiling water? Seriously? I know what he would say if I ever got to talk to him. I meant it sarcastically. Well, I know that you meant it sarcastically, you ding-dong. The point is that you only get to be sarcastic about something when you actually know what the shit you're talking about. So, to conclude this, same thing as with the film. The batteries were never exposed to 120 degrees Celsius. The next issue that he has is with the film that was used. Let's take a look.
From the moon or not, and I'm saying there's problems with how it's represented to us. And as a person with a background in science and physics and photography...
Oh, Gary, you have a physics and science and photography background? Wow, do those add up like coupons or something? How does that work? Please enlighten me. Anyway...
X-rays occur on the moon, high-level X-rays, and so when those of you did you remember film, and you would have to put it through the TSA machine, but a lot of people would want to take the film out so it wouldn't get exposed in X-rays. Do you remember that? Or are we so far into digital now? Those of you who do remember that we took our film out over ISO 400. Because that was very more light sensitive, made it more X-ray sensitive. We took it out because we didn't want to get it exposed to X-rays. Unfortunately, there's a lot of X-rays on the moon. How much X-rays are on the moon? They don't even know if an astronaut can survive it.
This citation is what you found? Wow. Just wow. On top of that, you don't even bother to grasp what this article that you're citing is about. Yes, X-ray bursts can cause serious damage to equipment, such as film cameras, or satellites for that matter. Did you hear about those Starlink satellites that just fell out of the sky? Well, yeah, X-ray bursts are an unpredictable thing, and it is something that we want to be prepared for as much as possible when we send people back to the moon for longer periods of time. But the average X-ray concentration is very well known in space and on the moon. And it has been known since the space program started. More on that in a second, but first a short disclaimer. I am no expert in film, let alone Kodak Ektachrome, let alone Kodak Ektachrome developed for NASA. So I had to do some research. And by research, I mean search the web for 20 minutes. Yes, Gary, 20 minutes, and I already have forgotten more about film in space than you will ever know. And I found this. Isn't that interesting, Gary? They actually did research before they sent the men and the cameras and the film to the moon. And they even hired a company to do it and to write a report about it. Of course, I will link the report in the description. NASA did what it always does. Research and testing for years before anyone ever thought about actually shooting up a rocket with people into space. So, Gary, let's look at this document, shall we? Oh my God! They actually found that if you use common fucking sense when handling film, just like you would do on Earth, your film will do fine in space. Wow. Well, kind of obvious, really. Actually a little bummer. Anyway, good thing that we checked. So, the film Kodak produced was special. It was extremely thin. Remember those 200 exposure film magazines we talked about earlier? And also the radiation dosage on the moon, again, on average, not taking into account sunbursts, is about 110 to 380 microsieverts, compared to Earth, where it's 2.4 millisieverts. Sorry. That's a lot of radiation, sure. Which means that the film will approximately age 100 times faster than on Earth. In other words, a few days in space, and I mean actual space, not just in the capsule, but outside, will age the film a few years. Now, every actual film expert will tell you that film can very well age several years and still work. Besides, some of the photographs do show signs of radiation. So again, Gary's kind of acting like all flat earthers. Gary blows minor issues way out of proportion and claims that everything about space photography ever is fake.
That NASA has just announced that they're sending two mannequins to the moon. Why? NASA will send artificial females to the moon to study the risks of radiation. Well, my goodness, did we not have a whole bunch of men just walking around on the moon, leaving their footprints all over the place? 2 artificial female bodies called Helga and Zohar will be sent to the moon. According to NASA, they travel around the Earth's satellite and for the first time measure radiation risks to women's bodies before the crews fly there. So, my boobies, my fallopian tubes are getting radiated. I'm just being silly, but why is NASA sending?
Well, this part is just evisceratingly painful. Well, Gary, here's the thing. Artemis is a multi-year project to bring humanity back onto the moon for longer periods of time. Not just a few hours, like during the Apollo missions, but for weeks or maybe months. And yes, there will be female astronauts up there, which, newsflash, is absolutely new. All astronauts on the moon this far were male. So, just using common fucking sense here, Gary. Isn't it absolutely the most responsible thing to do to fucking test what radiation will do to boobies and fallopian tubes? Because, well, any female astronaut might want to know if she will have to suffer medical issues for the rest of her life or not be able to have breastfeed kids or even have kids. This is fucking common sense, you fucking moron. Thank you for sticking with me for this long and enduring my rant. There's just one more thing to do, and that goes directly to you, Gary Wong. You have every single one of your claims debunked. Therefore, your assertion that photos on the moon or in space in general are impossible is just wrong. Your confirmation bias led you to spread lies and disinformation without applying even the smallest due diligence or even common sense. Now, you do have a big following, not only on your YouTube channel, I presume, so there's such thing as responsibility. If you were talking crap about NASA and the moon landings at a dinner party, I couldn't care less, really. But this video that you posted was prepared, published on purpose on your channel. I therefore demand for you to take down that video and you publish a statement which contains an apology. This apology is not for me, of course, but for the thousands of people at NASA and Hasselblad and other companies for that matter, who put their blood, sweat and tears into getting actual photographic documentation from the moon back to Earth. The Apollo missions were not only one of the greatest journeys of mankind, they were also one of the first ones that were documented on film and thus preserved for future generations. They were a great accomplishment, Gary, and you're just trampling on it with your ignorance and stupidity. Anyway, I will wonder if he ever gets back to me. Until then, I wish you guys all the best. Take care. Bye bye.